Hi, everybody. I'm Matt Iantoska with Gerber Kawasaki Wealth Management, and I'm the director of our Wealth Management Division. I'm excited to be here today with Jim Bergeron from Nuveen Investments to discuss family wealth education. Jim has an extensive background in the financial planning industry and has a specialized knowledge in helping prepare families and heirs to preserve and grow their wealth across multiple generations. The goal of this event today is really just to be a starting point for you and your family. These discussions can sometimes be tough to have or difficult to structure. So we're going to try to give you a little bit of an outline on how to do that. We'll take some questions at the end as well. So feel free to write the questions in the chat on the side of the box if you do have those, and we'll pull those up as we can. But with that in mind, I'll let Jim get started and feel free to ask questions.
Thanks, Matt. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. And as Matt indicated, we've got some thoughts that we want to share with you relative to this notion of family wealth education, but really defined around this idea that when it comes to wealth, when it comes to transitions, either during a lifetime or even through an estate process at death, there's more to a legacy than just the financial assets. And at the end of the day, what we're most concerned about is how do we help families to work through that process in a way in which it addresses both the known and maybe some of the unknown or unforeseen issues that might come up. And as a part of that, helping families to start to think about and maybe get a sense for how do we build the education appropriate for us to get to a level of dialogue and discourse with our financial professionals that ultimately helps this overall process. So today we're going to go through a few things. As I talk about some of the components of this, I'm going to start with just what's the need behind this. And many of us are accustomed to thinking about the need for the planning documents, even those documents that might help with issues during your lifetime, things like powers of attorney or those documents that take effect upon your passing, wills and or trusts. But the opportunity really is and should go beyond just the documents themselves. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's that need and why is it something that we spend some time talking about and how advisors can maybe help you with that conversation directly. We're going to then go through some thoughts around how you can begin thinking about implementing this. And again, a lot of this is meant for you to get a sense for how these things can work, but we don't expect for you to do it on your own. And that's part of the planning process, part of the reason and rationale why you work directly with advisors. Matt and I have had this conversation before. And the fact is that when it comes to families and wealth education, to some degree, it does take a team. And that's part of what we'll talk about today. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with what are some suggested activities and educational pieces that you can take into account as you work through this process. But let's start with this fairly widely held notion. And you hear it an awful lot. There is an amazing amount of wealth that's set to transition over the course of the next couple of decades. You can see on screen here that that number is large, whether it's truly 70 trillion or more or slightly less over the course of the next 2+ decades. The fact of the matter is a fair amount of wealth is set to transition. Now, the number is significant, but what most concerns me are the numbers of families that are impacted by that, the number of transitions that will happen through families themselves, and understanding both some of the opportunities and some of the potential obstacles is an important part of the overall discourse. And when you start to think about that, we know and understand, and certainly as planning professionals, know that there's concerns from parent standpoint about what these impending transitions, these wealth transfers might mean for their family members. Parents are oftentimes worried about the potential negative impact of wealth on their children or maybe even grandchildren. Interestingly enough, children are oftentimes concerned as well. You might be the child of a very successful parent, for instance, and stepping into those shoes, living up to some of those expectations, sometimes can be daunting and cause anxiety. So as wealth planners, we oftentimes think about the use of certain types of documents that can help us with these ideas. And for many of us, for instance, if we're worried about essentially seeding or dumping into the laps of future generations at young ages a fair amount of wealth financially from that standpoint, and oftentimes we'll see trusts put in place. And sometimes those trusts are written in such a way in which the assets are held and dispersed at certain time periods, maybe certain ages. 1/3 of a child's share at age 25, a third of the balance at age 30, the remaining balance at age 35. And part of the reason for that is, again, to provide some degree of a wrapper around those assets. But on its own, it's not enough. Oftentimes we'll see that if it's put in place really to maybe help a spendthrift child, sometimes it doesn't necessarily meet the objective. And it may turn a spendthrift child into just a patient spendthrift child. And so as a result, one of the things that we've started to develop over time and that I've seen throughout my career is this need to have more than just the plan, to start to inject some of the pieces that bring that plan to life, to provide the breadth within it. And when you think about that, this diagram depicts that. And I'm going to run through it fairly quickly, and then we'll get into some of the different components of it. But at the top, in that 12 o'clock position, what we refer to as the strategic wealth plan really are those documents that you might have in place. And I'll sometimes refer to a set of estate documents as the four corner documents. Do you have a current will and or trust in place? Sometimes we'll see the use of a trust in place of a will, with a will just acting to essentially transfer assets to that trust. But the first corner is, do you have a current will and or trust? What's current? Well, maybe sometime within the last 3 years or anytime there have been any life events within your family. Second corner document, a power of attorney, generally speaking for financial purposes. It provides the opportunity for someone to act on your behalf for financial decision making should you be incapacitated. If you're in an accident, for instance, and certain things need to be done financially, that power of attorney provides that document and that documentation. Third corner, a power of attorney for medical purposes. The reason, again, it's a document that assigns someone the ability to make decisions medically on your behalf and to work with your health professionals to actualize those decisions. And then the fourth document, I'll refer to it sometimes as a living will. And what do I mean by living will? This is nothing more than a document that communicates your wishes and desires should you be in a state in which you are unable to communicate and not going to recover. It's an unfortunate circumstance that we sometimes find family members in. This document underlines and outlines what are the measures that you want taken on your behalf. The purpose of this really is to help family members and help them through this process and help them, along with the medical professionals, make the best end of life decisions. So those four corner documents, that's the wealth plan. But going beyond that, there are some additional needs. And born out of our experience and working with a lot of different families through these transitions, at the end of the day, we know that the documents on their own may not be enough. And so adding to that, things like, for instance, something that memorializes who you are as a family. I'll sometimes refer to this as the GPS unit for an overall wealth plan. That compass or GPS unit provides the guidepost. As life events happen, whether there are births, deaths, marriages, divorces, this document, which outlines who you are as a family, what do you value, those things are incredibly important to the overall planning process, and especially as things evolve and as amendments are needed. This document continuously points back to what's your family purpose. What's your value? For instance, for us, we feel like our family's been touched by cancer more than our fair share. And so as a result, it's incredibly important for us to have the opportunity to fund those venues, those outlets that provide research, palliative care. It's an important part of who we are as a family, and it's part of what we put into our family's value statement. We might refer to it as a mission statement. But again, it's that compass or that GPS that you can keep referring back to, and that your professionals that you're working with, whether it's financial, insurance, or estate professionals, all of these individuals, in seeing that, get a better depiction of what are the things that you value, and it would help them in the work that they're doing. Second area that we would add in, we reference it as governance. It's not maybe that formal, but what we're really referring to is, how do you help yourselves as a family unit to practice decision making before you get to a point in time in which things become really difficult? And I'll give you an example. Many families, for instance, have items of sentimental value. And as a part of that, they're tangible items. It might be something like a pie plate. In fact, if you do a Google search for who gets grandma's yellow pie plate, you'll come across a website that's devoted to this particular idea around helping families to understand that oftentimes it's not about who got how much at an individual's passing, but who got what. And many of you can probably think about items in your own family, whether it's a piece of furniture that's been in the family's residence for generations, maybe, and a couple of family members knowing exactly where that's going to go in their individual residence going forward. Well, if that's not defined, then at the point in time in which emotions are running high, maybe it's the death of the surviving parent, at that point, if that item isn't identified and specifically noted as to where it's going to end up, oftentimes it becomes either the family's combined issue, or maybe, most disastrously, it becomes the issue that the executor has to deal with. And so as a result, thinking about those items ahead of time is a part of the decision-making process. Practicing that, giving yourselves a chance to understand how to make shared decisions together. As you heard from me earlier, part of what we value is the opportunity to maybe fund those outlets that do impact cancer and its impact on individuals directly. And so as a result, one of the things that we do as a family is to talk about what are the various outlets that are going to help and support that virtue for us, that value that we hold dear. It's a decision process, but it's with neutral wealth or neutral money. It's not going to any one particular individual, but we talk about it as a family. There are things like donor advised funds that provide opportunities to do that rather easily and efficiently. And a donor advised fund is nothing more than a charitable warehouse that you can set up, fairly cost effective, and you as a family can make decisions together as to which outlets you're going to recommend distributions come out of your charitable warehouse to directly. Provides great income tax benefits, and at the end of the day, it's an opportunity to ultimately fulfill some of your charitable desires. Third area that we'll talk about real quickly here, and then we'll get into some more detail, the idea around mentoring. And really at the end of the day, what I'm referencing is this notion of sudden wealth and the psychology that may go along with that. There's been a lot of work that has been done and a lot written on the idea of the psychology of sudden wealth. Sometimes we see it borne out in stories that lottery winners will tell, or professional athletes after their career ends and they've had a few years outside of the profession. And sometimes we'll hear those stories end with the assets are gone or the money is gone. There's a psychology that goes along with that. That psychology of sudden wealth also impacts inheritances. And so from our standpoint, the opportunity to maybe outline what are the things that families can do to start to educate themselves, maybe future generations, on how to deal with that psychology, how to become, in essence, a steward of wealth rather than a recipient of wealth. And there are plenty of opportunities to go through that process. And we'll start to talk about a couple of them. But really, at the end of the day, they can be defined along different age cohorts. So maybe the adage that you might be thinking about, or at least the question that might be thinking about, when do I start this? How soon is too soon if I've got young kids or young grandkids? My response is that adage that we've heard in the past. When's the best time to plant an oak tree? Well, the first best answer might be 30 years ago. Next best answer is right now. And so starting with different age cohorts, maybe young kids, and helping them to start to understand the concepts around financial acumen. Maybe something as simple as, what do things cost? Pricing games at young ages. Maybe as you work through teenage and early adulthood, understanding, for instance, the concept of credit and why valuable credit, strategic use of a credit card is incredibly important. And many of us as financial professionals can show you differences between the cost over the lifetime of a 30-year mortgage versus at maybe a 750 credit score rating versus a 580 credit score rating. And there's a fairly drastic difference in those costs. A lot of that coming down to essentially that credit score. Credit ratings are incredibly important for rental agreements, even employment now. So establishing that credit early on is incredibly important. And then as you move up through adult years, the opportunity maybe for some of those adult family members to be a part of a discussion that we have around, again, who are we as a family? What's our value? Many of these ideas, again, different depending upon the age cohorts, but really kind of driving at certain pieces. And we've divided them up here in this conversation around a concept that the book Kids, Wealth, and Consequences has come up with. And it really revolves around the idea of financial, intellectual, and emotional choices. Without that development, without the ability to understand what financial education means, you might run the risk of those future family members not understanding what money means, how to think about it effectively, how to save long term, that intellectual process of setting aside some monies now for future years. And as we think about that, we've gone through a fair amount of work in defining different activities. And I'll give you an example, again, using our own son. Just graduated from college. He's had summer employment for the last couple of years. But to ask him to take some of those employment earnings, which very well earned, certainly from his standpoint, at the end of the day, to ask him to take some of that and apply it to a traditional retirement account is asking an awful lot, especially when the response is, again, help me understand, when do I get access to these dollars? And the response to that, 50 years from now, that's a bit of a difficult sell. But at the same time, as family members, one of the things that we might do is to help fund some of that opportunity to learn what it means to set a long-term goal and work incrementally towards it. So rather than maybe taking some of their own dollars, maybe for those younger kids, those young adults that are earning summer employment this year, maybe the idea is matching some of those earnings with gifts from either a grandparent or a parent, but matching some of those earnings put into their own account that in turn gets positioned inside of a Roth IRA. And I think we all know, but if you don't know, a Roth IRA is just a type of retirement vehicle, but the real value and power in it is that not only do you get deferred growth in terms of taxes, but when the money ultimately comes out of a Roth IRA, it comes out tax-free. Real powerful benefit. And so that tax-free accumulation combined with tax-free distributions in the future, a powerful tool, especially for a young adult that's starting to make those contributions, maybe with family members' help early on with a long runway of potential growth. It helps build that intellectual acumen. And then finally, stewardship, the idea of social responsibility. One of the best ways of combating that psychology of sudden wealth really revolves around this notion of helping family members to understand what it does mean to be a steward, a responsible recipient of wealth, rather than money in, money out. Maybe it's thinking in terms of what this money means. It stems back to what we talked about a little bit earlier, the idea of defining who you are as a family and the value and the purpose of the family. And part of that might be, in turn, providing educational opportunities to support that. For instance, some of the families that we've worked with have set up these things called donor advised funds. And the rationale behind it starts maybe with you get some nice income tax benefits from that, but the opportunity to maybe provide those recommended distributions to charities, a public charity of the family's choice that aligns with the family's mission, value, is incredibly important. But the third opportunity is to layer in a family educational benefit. So think about it this way. Maybe the discussion around which charities we're going to benefit in alignment with our mission includes those younger family members, even through fairly young ages, but asking them to be a part of a family dialogue. I'm hesitant to call it a family meeting, because that makes us think sometimes that it's more formal than it needs to be. Family meetings sometimes can happen at the drive-through of a fast food restaurant. But that family discourse around which charities do we want to benefit, as those younger family members start to age and mature, asking them to be equipped to provide a recommendation. Which charity should we benefit? Is it the American Cancer Society? Are they a beneficial outlet for us? Well, maybe asking those younger family members through the portal of this donor advised fund, which would allow them to do research on different organizations, what their missions are, and how they fund that mission. That might be a great way of helping that individual to understand what it does mean to be a steward of wealth, rather than me telling my son that he should feel fortunate to be a part of the family that he is, giving him the chance, for instance, to actualize that, to be a part of the activities in which we're allowing for that, helps to build that notion of social responsibility, ultimately getting at, again, a stewardship mindset rather than a recipient mindset. That combats that potential instance of the psychology of sudden wealth working against him. And for many of us, our families will benefit from this type of education. Again, these are ideas that ultimately, in turn, serve the purpose of helping family members to understand and build that financial acumen that will help the overall wealth plan. One of the families that we work with had a very young daughter, and early on, that family asked that daughter to be a part of the family dialogue around which charities that they were going to benefit. Actually asking her to provide a written suggestion. And as you can imagine, at 7 years of age, it's not a philanthropic proposal, but in this case, just happened to be written on one piece of paper, one simple line. I think we should give money to Toys for Tots. They help kids at Christmas. And for that particular family, that was powerful. And it started a learning process early on. Again, the idea of helping family members to start to suggest and understand what it means to be a steward. I mentioned early on this idea of family mission statements. Well, those mission statements have certain components to them. I'm going to talk with you about how you can start to define maybe a mission statement for yourself. But really, at the end of the day, it's going to have these three pieces. Purpose. What's your family's purpose? What's the structure or the character of the family overall? And then where are your advisors brought into the conversation? In some cases, it might be to help younger family members who we've established those Roth accounts to understand what investments are appropriate for them. What's a mutual fund? What's an expense ratio? That's part of the educational process. And they can be built into family mission statements. In fact, you might want to think about, and there are certain questions that your advisors can help you with in uncovering what's your family's purpose, what's important to you, what are the important values that you want seeded to the next generation. Maybe even starting with some simple questions. How did you learn about money? And was that successful? For many individuals, they would say, I don't know that I would want to repeat for my kids the same path that I used to learn sometimes the really hard lessons about money. Why it might not make sense to cash advance one credit card to pay another. Difficult lessons some of us learn sometimes in life. We probably wouldn't want to repeat that for our kids. Well, that part works its way into this notion of family mission statements. And those mission statements can really be defined along some fairly simple questions, ultimately tying back to that notion of your family's GPS, your family's guidepost. So think about that. That in turn can work its way into another number of different examples, but you can see here within this particular family's mission statement, it covers off some things that are important, the values of offering appreciation and support to each other. The idea of family dinners being an important way of having a discourse. And in those family discussions, maybe practicing some decision making. Making sure that family members know they have to take responsibility for their own actions. And in some cases, again, that might be difficult for younger family members to learn, but that's a part of the process. And defining it together makes the implementation a whole lot easier, rather than mom and dad, for instance, just writing the statement and writing the values, and then in turn expecting family members to follow along with that. Incorporating them into that process can be incredibly impactful. Final piece that I'll reference here is that any true identification of who you are as a family should also incorporate those family traditions that you have. For instance, our family, when we were young kids, did this thing called fondue. Many of you know what fondue is, but this is really hardcore fondue. Boiling oil where you're cooking pieces of meat on sharp sticks dipped into that oil. Probably not something that you would want to do with young kids around the table. We did it, and it was a part of our year-end holiday tradition. It was important for us, and it's one of those things that we still hold dear to this day. It's a tradition that defined us as a family. It also gave us as a family an opportunity, because of the time period that you have to commit to this type of a meal, give us the opportunity to talk about more than just the events of the day and to share some of that discourse back and forth. Incredibly impactful. You have family traditions like that. If there are shared values within the family, for instance, maybe music education is important. And the idea may be that as younger family members are growing in that acumen, putting together a family concert can be a great way of referencing, for instance, some of the things that are important to the family, but allowing the family to interact with each other. Maybe it's cousins together. And I know sometimes when we go to those early childhood recitals, piano or other instruments, when it's our own child, it sounds like Mozart. When it's someone else's child, maybe not so much. But at the same time, you can imagine if it's all of your family members, aunts and uncles and grandparents and parents all together sharing this, can become incredibly powerful. And it's, again, a way of reinforcing the values that you might hold dear, the traditions that are important. We've gone through an awful lot. In a second, Matt, I'm going to ask you to maybe come back in, and we'll start asking if there are any that we want to maybe reference here. I know you've had the chance to work with a lot of clients as well, and a lot of families with some of these same concepts. So certainly, Matt, if there's something that you can think about that we should maybe address as well. We've gone through a lot fairly quickly here. But again, the idea behind this is to start to spur some thoughts and to spur maybe some some dialogue that follows along with this. But Matt, what do you think?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I wanted out of this, Jim, is just get people thinking about this topic. I think a lot of people typically do well on the kind of legal planning aspect. You set up your wills, you set up your trusts, and they stop there. But I think actually having conversations with your family and what's important to your family is what's going to drive a successful outcome. I think for us as a firm, we tend to work with a lot of younger individuals as well. And one of the biggest problems we see today is financial education still isn't taught in school. So either they're going to learn it by making mistakes going through life, or the older generation who has made some of those mistakes, as you mentioned, can help them avoid those mistakes. So I really love this topic, and think the psychology behind not only money, just family dynamics is something that needs to be better discussed. So we don't have any specific questions, but I have, I guess,
I couldn't agree more.
Points. One is, we tend to see two ends of the spectrum. Sometimes we'll have families that have done well for themselves, which say, you know what, I want to leave my kids everything, right? And then we'll have some on the other hand, which say, I want to leave my kids nothing, right? But both of those take some planning if you want that outcome to happen. And from your experience, Jim, what do you typically see happen, if a family leaves, let's say, one son everything, or leaves the kids nothing and doesn't discuss it? What do you typically see happen at that point?
Yeah, I'm smiling first, and I shouldn't be, right? Because at the end of it is a very serious part of the discussion. But I'm only smiling because I can recall early on in my career, I had an individual that had a fair amount of wealth, and we were talking about the estate plan. And the estate plan, when something like this, I'm sure that person read it somewhere, but it really was, I hope at my death, the last check out of my account is to the funeral home, and I hope that check bounces. And the idea was, I started with virtually nothing, and I don't want the expectation to be anything other than you have to work. You have to work hard for things. And that's perfectly valid. And we have many families that have gone through and made decisions about, for instance, how they want that wealth disseminated. All of it, though, starts with and needs to start with how you define legacy. And as you heard me say at the outset, Matt, legacy is more than the financial assets. We can set up structures around the assets. We can contain assets. We can differentiate where those assets ultimately end up. But without that notion of the purpose and why, and maybe it's not as direct and full frontal as just a written piece. This is why we didn't want you to have something. It's more a matter of an ongoing dialogue and discourse that families can have. But the idea of legacy needs to contemplate more than just those financial assets. And we see a lot of families that settle and feel that sense of accomplishment once just the documents are in place. And that's where we keep coming back to this idea around what it means to set a legacy. And for some of those families where maybe they're not necessarily thinking about seeding assets equally, the start point might be, well, let's define what equity means in this case. Equitable in terms of family distributions may not always mean equal, and that's okay. But what's not okay is leaving that essentially to future family members to decide on their own without any involvement, or at least any dialogue or discourse on the part of the senior family members. And that's where we can maybe help a little bit more. But again, the idea is there's got to be more breadth than just the documents themselves. We can accomplish anything with documents, as estate planning attorneys will tell you. And I've been in the industry long enough to know that there's no family issue that we would suggest a well-contrived and conceived trust can address.
Right.
But on its own, it's words on a paper. And that's where we feel there's a big difference.
Right. Yeah. And I have preschool age kids now too. And, thinking about, like you mentioned, how do we get them interested in this now, whether it's budgeting, whether it's causes they're passionate about. I do think the donor advised fund is a really fun option because you can include multiple generations, and it can just be things they're passionate about. If they like supporting wildlife, great. plenty of organizations that do that, and the kid can be involved in that. So I really like that. And then the who we are as a family, that kind of hits home too. I think we kind of all need to ask ourselves that question as a group and what we're trying to accomplish. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and again, this is meant to start the dialogue. I think the hardest part sometimes is just knowing where to start, right? We all might recognize that something like that family mission or value statement can have real import, but it's hard, right? If you just are starting from scratch, it's difficult to know how to even start the process. And that's where, again, the role of us as advisors is to guide that process and to suggest here are maybe some starting points, some things to think about. Maybe the opportunity is for multiple generational levels to provide some of the answers to those questions that I showed earlier on their own individually first, and then taking those responses and combining it into a holistic value statement for the family. For me, at least now, and you can tell by maybe the color of the hair on my head, and maybe a bit more part of the senior generations than I am the younger generations in the family. But a part of the value is in hearing what's important from that standpoint. I want to know what my son, Joe, thinks is important, and not just his idea of maybe echoing back to me something that I think might be important. He needs to be able to establish that on his own. And that's where, again, legacy survives multiple generations. And when you do these types of things, there's less chance that it dissipates and just evaporates over time.
Right. Yeah, and I want to stress too, we're talking generational planning, but I think these sort of conversations are important in almost any big financial decision that you have to make. One of the biggest that I see too is when someone's worked hard their entire life for 35 years and then they retire. And maybe they thought about, taking that first trip, but then when things calm down, what's next, right? What is my purpose now? What is my routine now? So I think these are good questions to have for anybody making a big life decision.
It's a great point, Matt. And we're suggesting too that this is ongoing, right? You might have that conversation and maybe even go through this process a few times during a couple of decades worth of time. And it might be, as you're thinking about, as you indicate, that transition from what my current career and what my career has been to whatever's next, whether it's retirement or second stage. And that's an opportunity to go through this discourse and dialogue and start to define these things. And it may evolve over time as you age from there. Maybe as you start to think about other decisions, it becomes incredibly important. So the other piece of this that I didn't suggest maybe as much as I should have early on, and that is this is meant to be a living and breathing platform and structure. It doesn't mean that it's set it up once, forget it. Define your family's mission statement, put it in a frame and hang it on a wall and forget about it. No, it's got to be a living and breathing dialogue and discourse.
Perfect. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time, Jim. I love this topic. Just listening to you speak is so helpful. I hope everybody else got some great information out of this. And as Jim mentioned, this is just a starting point. Reach out to your advisor if this is something that you want to discuss with them. Highly recommend it, even if it's just a small starting point. The benefit of our firm, again, is we work with multiple generations already for the majority of our clients. So tying people together should not be that difficult. And we just want to make sure that your family works well together and you guys have your family mission or what you want to achieve out of life. So thanks again, Jim. And I appreciate it.
Thanks. And I'm just going to read real quickly, maybe that last slide. So Alex, if you could put that back up. Thanks. And for our own compliance purposes, this material is not intended to be a recommendation or investment advice. Does not constitute a solution to buy, sell, or hold a security or an investment strategy, and is not provided in fiduciary capacity. Information provided does not take into account the specific objectives or circumstances of any particular investor or suggest any specific course of action. Investment decisions should be made based on an individual investor's objectives and circumstances and in consultation with his or her advisors. The views and opinions expressed are for informational and educational purposes only as of the date of production and may change without notice at any time based upon numerous factors such as market conditions, legal, regulatory developments, and other uncertainties. Nuveen provides investment advisory solutions through its investment specialists Nuveen Securities, LLC. It's a member of FINRA and SIPC, and I appreciate your indulgence in letting me read through that disclosure.
Thanks again, Jim.
You bet.